Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Adam Ward, Director of Studies. I'm here filling in for Mark Fitzpatrick, our Director for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, who is just jetted in from the Middle East and is struggling his way here. And he will probably arrive in time to ask some searching questions himself, so we'll look forward to that. The June 14th Iranian presidential elections produced, contrary to general expectations, a victory for cleric and former nuclear negotiator Hassan Rouhani, who's going to take office on the 3rd of August. And we're here to decipher the domestic political reasons for that election outcome and to try to anticipate what international consequences it might carry. In his campaign, Rouhani seems literally to have gone around the country stirring up moderation, striking a contrasting pose as against the extremism and siege mentalities, as one might see it, of the notionally front-running conservative candidates. He appears to have been the beneficiary of popular dissent at the state of the economy and by extension at the international economic sanctions that are biting. He made clear his intention to enter into more forward-leaning negotiations on the nuclear program. Some external observers have drawn hope from the fact that the conservative clerical establishment centered on the supreme leader has not only countenanced Rouhani's election, but has, according to press reports, also acquiesced to the idea of bilateral engagement of the US. Now, there have been many false dawns on that front. Rouhani proved a tough and a staunch defender of the nuclear program as a negotiator. He has many domestic political balances to strike, but perhaps the alignments and the ingredients for a limited opening are now gathering into place. We're going to find out from our three speakers today. We will start with Dina Esfandiari, who is a research associate here at the IISS, linked to the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program. She has a particular focus on the Middle East and Iran in respect of non-proliferation questions. Then we'll dig a little bit deeper after an overview from Dina on the election and some of the foreign policy questions that have been thrown up by it. We'll delve deeper into the domestic aspects, turning first to Saeed Barzin, who's an Iran analyst at the BBC Persian service, and then to Azadeh Moaveni, who is the former correspondent for the Middle East for Time magazine and now writes for a number of prominent outlets. So Dina, over to you.
Thank you. So as Adam mentioned, I'm just going to give you a brief overview very brief overview of the elections and what happened, and then turn to foreign policy implications. So as you know, the Iranian elections were a bit of a surprise, and this despite the fact that in the months prior to the elections, politics were quite volatile, but it seemed that they had been predetermined. There was Ahmadinejad's final year saw the worsening of internal disputes in Iran, with a succession of public attacks and calling him to parliament. And it was likely that his persistence in stirring trouble was intended to perhaps secure support amongst the masses as he was losing it within the regime. So the big question really for these elections was, would Khamenei risk a competitive election in order to overcome some of the damage to the system's credibility? But would he do that at such a troublesome time, and would he risk another 4 years of uncertainty, as he had with Ahmadinejad? Although many people thought that it was unlikely he would, it seems we were proved wrong, and the regime instead decided to focus on ensuring legitimacy through encouraging higher voter turnout during the elections. So it seems the Iranians have made clear their desire for change. There are a lot of different explanations as to why things happened the way they did. Some call this a victory for the sanctions regime. Others see it as Khamenei's willingness to act leniently in the face of public pressure. And others argue that in the end this was always the plan. After all, Rouhani passed the Guardian Council screening. He has a long tradition of loyalty to the Islamic Republic, and he didn't support the opposition in 2009, for example. In addition to this, constitutionally, the Iranian president doesn't actually have that much power. At the end of the day, Khamenei is still the ultimate decision maker. And so there are two main factors to consider. Rouhani's willingness to change things, and also his ability to do anything, even if he is willing. A good example of this, for example, is Khatami. He was, it seemed, willing to make a lot of changes, but his hands were tied, and in the end he wasn't able to do much. So it remains to be seen what Rouhani's victory will mean for Iran. The president is actually mainly responsible for the Iranian economy, but he may be able to influence the general mood and direction the country is taking. And contrary to what we might have thought initially, his relatively good relationship with Khamenei will actually be quite a big positive thing, because it might mean that he'll be able to sway Khamenei's views on certain subjects. So now I'll just talk a little bit about foreign policy. Firstly, it's important to say that foreign policy is not under the president's responsibility. It's the supreme leader and the IRGC that lead foreign policy in Iran. But Rouhani does seem to have more moderate tendencies. Interestingly, he also has a better understanding of foreign policy than his predecessor, for example. Rouhani was for many years, in fact, I think he still is, or he will be until he's inaugurated, the head of the Center for Strategic Research in Iran, which is an Iranian think tank that focuses on foreign policy issues. One of the center's main drivers is, well, one of the things that they say is that the focus of Iran's sphere of influence should actually be the Gulf and Central Asia rather than the wider region, which is really interesting. And one of the first things that Rouhani has done since being elected is that he's already spoken about mending relations with countries like Saudi Arabia. The question now is it too late? Will Saudi Arabia be willing to mend relations with Iran? There's also a better international understanding of Rouhani's views, again because Rouhani's spent a lot of time doing a lot of writing on foreign policy, and because of his think tank. So it's likely to be a lot less opaque than under Ahmadinejad. The other interesting thing is whether this will be an opportunity to re-examine some of the drivers of Iranian foreign policy. The traditional ideological driver, which was to a certain extent represented by Jalili in the elections, was obviously very unpopular. So it'll be interesting to see whether there's going to be a retreat of the ideological drivers in favor of economic interests, for example. Having said all of this, it's unlikely that Iran's grand goals for the region will change. Iran has always made clear that it aims to be a dominant power in the region, and its existing foreign policy principles are very entrenched. So we'll have to wait and see whether he'll actually be able to impact them. In addition, Rouhani has indicated that he won't deviate from current Iranian policy on regional issues. Syria is the main one. Iran at the moment has far too much invested in Syria, and it seems like it is trying to demonstrate that this policy of relying on proxies in countries like Syria, but also in the region, is working. So it's likely that once he's in power, what he'll do instead is just focus on stressing the importance of involving Iran in finding a solution to the Syria issue. So likely through getting Iran involved in the talks, for example. In terms of the nuclear issue, the big question is there any hope for the talks? One of the big questions that came up is Rouhani's election, will it mean that Khamenei might be more willing to compromise? After all, if Jalili had won, everybody would have said, well, this is a clear signal that we don't want to compromise in the talks. Well, Iran doesn't want to compromise in the talks. So this might be an opportunity to address some of the old difficulties, and there might be more flexibility in Iran's negotiating posture. We'll have to wait and see who he appoints as part of his negotiating team, but it's likely that he's going to rely on technocrats that know the file very well. Some of the names that have been thrown out are Salehi or Veliyati. Also, Rouhani's stance on the nuclear issue has led to a little bit of optimism. In his first press conference, for example, I think it was in mid-June, he really insisted on greater transparency with Iran's nuclear program. He said that Iran sought to reduce tensions and sanctions and one of the most interesting quotes was, "We will try to win back trust with the West." But after all, he is a supporter of the program, and just like most of the regime leaders, he sees it as a manifestation of technological achievement and national sovereignty. But he does understand the game of give and take much more than his predecessor did, and certainly than Jalili does. Remember, in 2003, it was Rouhani that agreed to the partial suspension of the enrichment program, and he did this all the while bragging to domestic audiences that suspension was only a tactical ploy to enable the nuclear program to advance in other ways. Something that he repeated during his election campaign in TV interviews, for example. So clearly he understands the game. He knows how it's supposed to work. But Iran is expecting a few things in talks. Firstly, reciprocity in weight and substance of a deal. This means sanctions relief, but not just the promise of relief at some point, a clear timeline of when Iran can expect to get some kind of sanctions relief. Iran is well aware of the constraints that the EU, but particularly the US, faces in removing some of these sanctions, and so doesn't want to feel like it's giving everything up for a long-term promise at some point that sanctions will be removed. One other thing is that it's important to convince the regime that sanctions are intended just to prevent the nuclear program from developing and becoming a nuclear weapons program, not to induce regime change, which is what the government believes at the moment. And this is where on sanctions, it's where the EU is an important actor in particular, because it can deliver where the US can't. It has more flexibility where the US doesn't. So it would be interesting to see whether they're able to perhaps offer a new kind of dialogue with Iran instead of just going back to the previous scheme of, the E3 talking to Iran. Iran will be expecting some kind of acceptance of its right to enrich. Now, admittedly, this under the NPT is not a right. The right is to peaceful nuclear technologies if you're compliant with the NPT, but this has become too big of an issue within Iran for us to just gloss over it. So the question now is, will Iran be able to accept enough limits on its enrichment program that would prove the peacefulness of the program and allow the West to accept Iranian enrichment? Finally, Iran will want some kind of agreement on the end goal, the end state. Although they understand that the nuclear issue is the main problem at the moment in relations with the West, they would like perhaps to sit down and at least have a promise that talks will continue and that the international community will be willing to discuss Iran's larger strategic role in the region and perhaps have a clearer definition of its relations with the EU and the US. But for talks to succeed, there's going to have to be decisive leadership on both sides. On the other side, the US will also have to test any diplomatic opportunity, and this seems to be one such opportunity. But the question is, are expectations on both sides too great? And do both sides, do they just see it too differently in order for anything to be done? One of my colleagues has this great quotable sentence that he says very often. He says that many see Iran as a nuclear program with a country rather than a country with a nuclear program. And this kind of explains how Rouhani will need somebody from the outside to confirm that they have an international partner for their policies and in the talks, and they have a reason to be making concessions. Because if every Iranian, not offer, but every, Iran's willingness to talk is being stonewalled on the other side, then hardliners within Iran will turn around and say, well, you see, openness doesn't work. And there might be a, reverting back to a policy of resistance, which is what Iran's been doing for the last little while. So in conclusion, I'm cautiously optimistic about Rouhani's election, but unfortunately quite pessimistic about the international community's ability to respond to this new opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. Saeed.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to focus on the domestic situation and where Mr. Rouhani stands, and what has been the significance, strategic significance of these elections. What have we learned from them? I think the main message is that of change. The way that the public behaved prior to the elections and during the election campaign, and the fact that it participated in the great numbers, over 70% that it did, the way that the political establishment behaved, in that it accepted the return of the pragmatists and the reformists back into the political process, the way the degree of flexibility shown by the supreme leader, as pointed out earlier, and the way that the political forces themselves handled the elections. Although their main candidates were not allowed to run, Rafsanjani, Khatami were not allowed to run, they compromised and accepted a deal over the issue. All these things mean that all the participants accepted that the main narrative of the election was change. They all wanted change. Now, the way that the population at large agreed to participate is extremely significant. There was great hope on parts of some opposition groups in Iran, and many of them boycotted the elections, that people would not be taking part, particularly after the elections 4 years ago, where there was a huge dispute. As you know, there were huge demonstrations, millions turned out on the street opposing the election results. There was the idea that this time people would not be taking part. But people did take part. People did take part. Did they not know that this is not a free election? Did they not know that this is not a fair election? That this is not a democratic election? Of course they did. Of course they did know. But nevertheless, they did take part in the election as an act of compromise. And this fundamentally means that although they want change, they want moderate, calculated, risk-free change. They don't want a Syria. They don't want an Egypt. They don't want an Iraqi situation. They don't want a Libya. They want change, but they want their fridge at the end of the summer holidays, and they want to buy a new computer for their kids, and they want to go on holidays during summer months. They don't want a war on the streets. So the second message is that people want change, but they want it in moderate portions, well calculated, without risk. The third lesson I think one could learn from the elections is that it was a coalition of pragmatists and reformists which won the day. As you know, in Iran there are 4 political factions, and you have the far right, which has supported Mr. Ahmadinejad for the past 8 years, and in the terms of the spectrum, I'm speaking about how they are willing to approach political change. How much political change are they willing to accept? The far right does not want any change. Quite on the contrary, it wants to restrict further the political process which exists in Iran. This is the basic identification of the far right. You have the conservatives, the mainstream conservatives, who are happy with the status quo. They might want some degree of change, but generally they are happy with how things are developing. And then you have the pragmatists, which are clearly identified with Mr. Rafsanjani, the former president, and then you have the reformists. These are the 4 main factions of the political establishment. And it was a coalition of the pragmatists and the reformists which won the day. And this is extremely significant. And more significant is the fact that it was with the leadership of the pragmatists and not the reformists that the coalition won the day. And the reformists are well aware of this. They know that they're not in the lead position. They know that they're not in the deciding position. They have to accept the leadership of the more cautious, pragmatist faction. And so this, if they are able to maintain this coalition, they would be in a position of strength. If this coalition cracks up for some reason, and that is a possibility which the far right and the conservatives are working on, the success of Mr. Rouhani will be very much in danger. Who were the losers? It was the right wing. It was the right wing who were the main losers. The people who supported Ahmadinejad for the past 8 years, who maintained him in power, were the main losers in these elections. Their candidate was Mr. Jalili, the current nuclear negotiator, and he got only 11% of the vote. The smallest, well, not the smallest, but one of the smallest shares of the whole lot. That is extremely significant because they have lost their strategic strength, their strategic position, which they previously had in the political establishment. And as for the future, I think it's going to take them quite a while before they will be able to create some kind of cohesion, ideological, political, organizational cohesion within themselves in order to come back to the political mainstream. It is also significant to realize that the conservatives, the conservative faction, is still very much in control of the political establishment. Of course, the executive has been won by the pragmatists, by the reformists. Mr. Rouhani is going to take over next month. But the rest of the political establishment is firmly under the control of the conservative faction. You cannot underscore the significance. They're still very much in power. They control the judiciary, they control the legislature, they control the house of the leader, they control the military establishment, they control the security establishment. So they are very much a power to be reckoned with. And their candidates, who were Mr. Ghalibaf, the mayor, and Rezai, won a huge portion of the vote. So we have to very much consider where they stand and where they are, how they're going to play in the coming years. Now, I know there was a speaker a couple of weeks ago here, and he referred to this election process as a sign of weakness of the political establishment in Iran and a sign of the weakness of the supreme leader. I think, on the contrary, it shows the maturity of the political establishment, and it shows the maturity of the supreme leader, and it shows their flexibility, and it shows the legitimacy which they have managed to gain from this political process, from this political event. So I don't see these elections as undermining the system. On the contrary, I see it as strengthening the system. It has put the supreme leader in a more flexible position vis-a-vis the political faction and vis-a-vis the population at large. It has involved the population in the political process. It has brought back the reformist and the moderate factions which were alienated after the 2009 elections. It has brought them back into the political process without giving them any advantages. They had demanded the release of the political prisoners as one of their top priorities prior to the elections, and the supreme leader managed to bring them back into the political process without giving them that advantage, without any concessions. And he did not even allow their top candidates, i.e. Mr. Khatami and Mr. Rafsanjani, to participate. However, they're back in the political process. So I think the elections show that the political culture and the political system are generally more mature, and the maturity is evident on the side of all the players, and I think that is so I share your cautious optimism, but I'm not going to comment on the pessimism that I might have about the foreign element in this story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Azadeh, more cautious optimism or pessimism from you?
Well, I'm going to talk about the economy, so unfortunately that seems to only inspire pessimism.
That's good.
And I'm mainly in this, I'm relaying, I think, a lot of the slightly dark and very caution, encouraging remarks and things that we're reading in recent days by people who are close to Rouhani himself, who've been having conversations with him about the economy and who've related. I'm just going to quote the former mayor, Karabashchi, the former mayor of Tehran, who said, we met with him recently and he'd been briefed after the election a bit more thoroughly about many sort of the country's files, especially the economy. And he said that, I was accused during the campaign of offering a dark portrayal of things, and now I realize that I was actually providing a really bright portrayal of things. So this is the man himself sort of characterizing his own pretty biting criticism of how things have gone and how the economy had been handled as too light. I'm going to talk about the economy mainly because I think this was arguably an election that was about the economy. That is something that can be sort of argued from different angles. Some are saying, well, this is about sanctions, and sanctions forced Iranians to come out. Sanctions forced the conservative consensus around the nuclear program to be fractured. But this is all because of what sanctions, and in combination with pretty intense domestic mismanagement of the economy, led to, which is at some point inflation that peaked at 110%, but now hovers and has hovered between 30 and 40%. In unemployment that officially is estimated at 12%, but unofficially is at 20, and for youth unemployment is estimated at about 30. An Iranian currency that has been devalued extensively. And so this is something that I think forms a backdrop to a lot of the sort of surprise dynamics that emerged around this election, both the turnout and I think the fracturing of the conservative establishment that we saw on display during the debates and leading up to the election. I think Rouhani around the economy did not present as specific and articulated plans of some of the other candidates, but his election has, I think, very much encouraged people to be hopeful about what he might be able to do with the economy. The price of the dollar dropped after his election. A prominent bazaar merchant said, we've not seen this kind of calm in 20 years. And I think that there's great eagerness and anticipation for the cabinet that he appoints. And it's a bit difficult, I think, to have this conversation without knowing who he's going to try and appoint in the very important ministries. But we do think, I think we do know that he will draw upon former executives like Karabashchi, the former mayor of Tehran, and the sorts of figures who have expertise but who've been out of politics and economic planning for the last 8 years and who have ties to the private sector and may inspire some confidence. I think he has mentioned specific plans as a private sector investment plan that would overhaul the business environment. There are a lot of very outdated regulations that make it difficult for Iranian manufacturers, for Iranian businesses to deal with labor, to basically oversee a lot of their activities, and that's been passed but not approved, and so he's talked about actually seeing these things through the system. I think with the economy there's a lot of overarching problems that arise out of sanctions, and especially the banking restrictions that come out of sanctions. So to an extent, there's a context to this that will be beyond Rouhani's control. None of those sanctions will be dialed down quickly, and once they are, and if they are, I don't think the effects will be felt for quite some time. But there are things within the realm of the domestic economy that he can certainly take up. Inflation is one, and he's indicated that he has plans and ways of trying to ease this. I think inflation in countries that don't have such a politicized economic system is something that can actually be dealt with in a matter of months, and has been in cases of very endemic hyperinflation. But for Iran, Iran is coming out of 8 years of a fairly reckless economic management. I think the Ahmadinejad tenure was one in which the state tried to negotiate its relationship with Iranians and to conduct politics through the economy. We saw that mainly in the case of subsidy reform, which ended up being incredibly inflationary and costing more than the subsidies that it intended to do away with. So I think there are areas like this, subsidy reform, currency policy, where there's actually quite a bit of space outside of the chaos being wrought by sanctions for some measure of improvement. Currency policy, for example, for much of the past 8 years has made an imported apple in Iran cheaper than a domestically produced apple. This is something that anyone with an Iranian relative will have heard sort of ad nauseum. But it's significant because agriculture is 10 to 15% of Iran's GDP, and undermining the agriculture sector in that way through this kind of monetary policy has been sort of one of the ways in which sort of economic policy has willfully mismanaged the areas that it had under its own purview beyond sanctions and what that has done. Corruption is, of course, something that's going to be very, very difficult for Rouhani to tackle. This is something that's a very endemic and pathological part of the Iranian economy, the way that contracts are awarded, cronyism, and the system of patronage that basically allows Revolutionary Guard front companies to bid for contracts, lucrative contracts, subcontract them out to firms who actually have the technical expertise to carry them out, and skim sort of billions in the end across the top of that. So all of these things are going to take quite a lot of time and a lot of political will to deal with. That's why a lot of the reformists around Rouhani are arguing that actually he should move forward first on areas where he has the areas under his control where he can deliver tangible change soon. So that this mandate that he has at 51% of the vote, that these people will not be disillusioned very quickly. And areas where he does have some measure of direct ability to change things is the civil sphere. I think Rouhani, within the Iranian context, has made extremely progressive, liberal-sounding statements during the course of his campaign and afterwards about citizens' rights, censorship, internet filtering, gender segregation at universities, satellite television, all issues of enormous concern to Iranians in the course of their daily life. He's been very blunt, and I think in a lot of these areas he will have some measure of support across the political spectrum. For example, gender segregation has been roiling Iranian higher education. It is not widely supported by the majority of Iranians. It's been enacted without legislative approval. It's had basically no governmental oversight, and it's resulted in tens of subjects being off limits to men and to women, depending on whether they're hard sciences or humanities. So these are areas where I think that people, reformists especially, are quite hopeful that he'll be able to bring some tangible changes about soon to create a sort of space for himself to deal with the more knotted changes down the line. I think we've had, though, the last couple of weeks, I think, illustrations of how difficult that's going to be at the same time, because there's a mentality that's saturated across layers of the country's security apparatus, very powerful state organs to move in exactly that opposite direction. And how is he going to be able to rein that in? For example, the Iranian national volleyball team was playing a match against Italy, and state broadcasting basically suspended live broadcast of the match. It started replaying playbacks on loops because there were women wearing short sleeves in the audience. And this is something that made Iranians furious. But the head of state broadcasting is appointed by the supreme leader. And so areas in which he's made promises, where he's encouraged and I think brought out the middle class urban vote around these kind of promises to liberalize political and social space, are not necessarily areas under his direct control, all of them. He talked about the importance of understanding Facebook and social media as an opportunity and not as a threat. But last week in Karaj, outside Tehran, 50 people were arrested for a water fight that was planned on Facebook, and the Facebook planning of it was sort of described in the conservative website as the most dangerous thing since probably the election. So in terms of the sort of reformist strategizing camp around him, I think people are saying his hands are tied around the economy. The economy has big picture intractable problems, but around these issues, he can try and satisfy some of the people who voted for him. It kind of remains to be seen how he's going to play the game. I will very quickly just bring this in, and I think Saeed touched upon this, and this is something, again, I'm bringing up because I think it's something that's being debated in the Iranian media quite a lot right now, and amongst people close to Rouhani as one of the most sensitive measures and issues that will affect what he will be able to do. Is will there not be hardcore, that sort of hard right pressure group, resistance group, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of euphemistic terms for them. But the groups, the very far right groups in the Iranian political system who we've seen in the past 20 years, especially under President Khatami, who made it their business to block any kind of reform and liberalization through killings, assassinations, sabotaging of foreign policy through things like taking British Navy personnel hostage in the waters of the Persian Gulf. Are these resistance groups, or whatever you want to call them, are they going to resort to those kind of means again, or are they going to become involved in politics? Are they going to form parties? Are they going to develop their media outlets? Are they going to try and participate in the process or revert to sabotage? And I think that this is a real concern. That thinking hasn't disappeared in Iran. The very conservatives like Saeed Jalili got several million votes, and so that has not disappeared at all. And I think there's a great deal of worry that they may try to sabotage. I think, like so much of this, it's going to be wait and see. But I think that's one area that's being seen inside Iran as a concern in what Mr. Rouhani is able to take ahead.
Great, thank you very much. So to summarize then, Dina was encouraged by the election result in terms of its potential significance, but maybe a little concerned that the international community wouldn't be agile enough to respond and might, as it were, miss the bus on that. Saeed underlined the fact that the election outcome demonstrated a desire and an appetite for moderate change, and a tendency there reinforced by the fact that in this pragmatic reformist coalition that's coalesced, it's the pragmatists who are very much driving this, and at the same time, within the wider context, an entrenched conservative establishment whose strength is sufficient to allow it to attempt some flexibility, it would appear. And Azadeh, I think you were touching on the parlor state of the economy, and I suppose the question there would be, to what extent does that play into the hands of those people who do feel that there needs to be progress on the nuclear negotiation to try and find a way of relieving some of the pressures generated by international sanctions? And then the question is, beyond the basic calming effect which Rouhani's election has had on the economy, can he move forward with a real agenda for measures that will improve the macroeconomic performance of the country, and the economy, which has perhaps been too politically managed, needs to be pushed into a more technocratic form of management in the future. So we'll spend the rest of the time that we've got now with questions and comments from you. And if you want to catch my eye, just raise your hand and then identify yourself when I've pointed at you, if that's okay. Mark Fitzpatrick, who's just re-emerged.
Apologies for being late. I just came from a country that has a great interest in the issues, a lot of skepticism. I was in Israel. And the biggest question maybe was, will the Supreme Leader allow any change? And there was divided opinion on it. Some were pointing to some small signs of a willingness to engage, but on the other hand, no actual engagement to date. And I was just saying, even if you engage, I mean, engagement is not the objective. The objective is stopping a latent nuclear weapons capability. So I'm just wondering, maybe I missed it, the willingness of the Supreme Leader actually to allow any change.
Who wants to tackle that?
Well, I think that is possibly the most critical factor in the calculation. How far is the Supreme Leader willing to change? And there are arguments on both sides, as you clearly say, and everybody, I think, is waiting for the signs, and it's going to very much depend on how everybody is going to play. He has shown flexibility. We have to give him that, and he has benefited from that flexibility. We have to take that into consideration. The general expectation was Jalili was his man. They're going to rig the election. It's a fraud. Jalili is going to become the president. They're going to continue with their policies. This was the narrative before the elections by many observers and analysts. It didn't play that way. They were much shrewder. He opened up the system sufficiently that he would be able to control it, so it didn't get out of hand, it didn't become chaotic. He allowed the reformists and the pragmatists to move back into the system and participate and win the game, and although he didn't allow their top candidates. So he's shown flexibility. And let us not forget that the Iranian regime has been through major changes in the past 34 years, and it has handled them. It went through a period of revolutionary war with Iraq, it went through a period of reconstruction with Rafsanjani, it went through a period of reform with Khatami, it went through a period of social justice and right-wing policies with Ahmadinejad, and now I think it is sufficiently strong to handle a period of pragmatic politics. We don't know how far these policies will go. It's very hard to say, but I'm not a pessimist on it. The fact that he has allowed these elections to take place, that he has shown the flexibility, that he sees the benefits of 70% of the people coming out to vote, means that he might have the appetite. He might have the appetite to accept more change. But of course, he'll be very cautious. He will be very calculative, as he has been with the elections. They took every step. They took very long-term strategies, and they put them in place in order to manage these elections. And I think that kind of an approach will be applied to other issues as well. Very cautious, very calculated, and optimistic rather than not.
What are the signs that we should be looking out for to gain a better understanding as to whether this is a tactical adjustment or rather than a strategic change?
Well, I suppose strategic change is always made of tactical moves. So in that way, tactical moves could have strategic consequences. I'm not saying that the regime has sat down and decided, well, we're going to give up what we were, and we're all going to go secular, and we're going to capitulate on the nuclear dossier, and we're going to accept the collapse of the Syrian regime. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that they are approaching their various problems with a new attitude, that they are bringing back pragmatists into office, and these people are ready, are prepared to have a fresh look at the issues and use fresh tactics. Their criticism of the nuclear dossier during the election period, I think, is most significant, and it shows that they are willing to show flexibility and open up on various issues.
Can you come in on this?
I would just add that I think there are two variables that have shifted significantly, and so I think how Khamenei does or doesn't shift his position, is not clear. But I think that there are two things that have changed, and one is that I think it's unprecedented to have had a senior advisor like Velayati come out so publicly, basically denouncing the country's nuclear diplomacy, which has been ultimately determined by Khamenei himself. So I think that kind of fracturing, that kind of public condemnation of his own policies is something that is new. I mean, that's not something that's happened probably to Khamenei ever before in the course of his supreme leadership. I think the second is having someone in the position of president who's quite influential, who's got fairly strong connections across the establishment, within the clerical establishment as well, being the interlocutor between Khamenei and the West. I think Khatami did not play that role, did not want to play that role, and did not. Ahmadinejad clearly had his own game. And so I think someone in that role who is determined, I think, to reach some sort of compromise may be able to bring about behavioral changes in Khamenei that we would not have seen or been able to expect had there not been that kind of shifting of positions. I think in terms of signs, the appointment of a new nuclear negotiator will be something to look for. I mean, Salih Jalili, I think, will have to be sacked, and who will be put in his place, I think, will be an early indication of where that's all going to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to expand on what you were saying, I completely agree. Rouhani's position within the regime, I mean, he's actually got quite a strong position. He's been working in it for many, many years, and he is very well known for his ability to negotiate, to talk, to make deals with absolutely everyone, something that, as you said, Ahmadinejad was unable to do. So that's going to be very important. But having said that, you also can't expect the changes to happen too fast. When Khatami tried to make changes too fast, everybody panicked, and he was blocked. Anything that he was able to do was just stopped. And this includes some of the appointments that he tried to make within government in order to put some of his supporters and reformists in place. So it's going to have to be really, really slow. And this is where what I was saying before about having some kind of external confirmation of what he's doing, that this is where that's important, because if he can demonstrate that he's got a partner either within the EU or with the US, and that the other side is willing to negotiate with him, and he might actually reap some benefits from these negotiations, then his position will be stronger, and we can expect even more.
Great. Yes, you, sir.
I'm Bijan Farhoudia, Voice of America Persian Service. I just want to ask you this question: that why is there such a effort to put positive spin of everything that has happened in Iran since June 14th? Because we know that under when Khatami was elected, Iranian regime was in the danger of being just ruptured because of the price of the oil dropped to like $7 to $10. So they brought somebody to put a positive spin on the regime. They brought Mr. Khatami. And before him, it was Mr. Rafsanjani. 8 years, they called him a moderate. And we know what happened under Rafsanjani. 275 people got assassinated outside Iran under his leadership. So why do you think that Rouhani will be the guy who can change everything in Iran, as Ms. Sfandiari said, but it's going to be a slow change? Why should we believe this gentleman?
Mm-hmm. Just the acceptable face of the Islamic Republic. Is that right?
No. I think you have to look at the aspiration of the Iranian people for the past 100 years. That's where you've got to look and find your answer. Iranians, since the constitutional revolution in 1905, 1906 constitutional revolution, have aspired for political freedom and the rule of law. And they have not achieved it. They failed 60 years during the Pahlavi period, and they have failed fundamentally in the past 35 years as well. But the aspirations are there, and many people in Iran, the 70 million people who live there, are working towards them, in the middle classes, in the educated classes, in the political elite, in the various sections of the society. And these changes are the result of those efforts. The coming to power of Mr. Khatami and what he achieved during those years was not a show for us foreigners sitting outside Iran to fool us. It was an effort by many thousands of Iranian intellectuals, politicians, middle classes, to create a better society, to create a more open society, to create a society where the rule of law exists, to create a society where people are free to speak. It was not a show. It was a real effort. And it had achievements, and it's failed in many ways. It had its achievements. It was the only period in the history of modern Iran where the state put finance, political will, and cultural support to expand the trade unions, to expand the political parties, to allow freedom of the press, to allow the women's movement, to speak of it as a show to fool foreigners, I think is not really correct. And I think what is happening now is another effort by all those people who believe in these ideals. They might fail. There are no guarantees. Who can give guarantees? But it is a real effort. It's a tremendous effort. It might win. It might lose. We don't know. Everybody's risking it, and they're putting their backs into it. And I think it's worth giving them the chance.
Yes, you please.
Hugh Chalmers from Brucey. I've got a question for Dina about the negotiations. It kind of comes in two parts. The first is kind of how they go about negotiating and essentially to what ends is the second part. On the first part, from the perspective of the National Security Council and the nuclear negotiator, whoever it ends up being, are they more happy about the fact that Rouhani is in or that Ahmadinejad is out? In the past, Ahmadinejad has probably made their lives a little bit more difficult than they needed to be by kind of the occasional outburst of rather violent rhetoric towards regional states. Do you feel that the more important factor in terms of their negotiating stance and tactics is that they no longer have to worry about Ahmadinejad? A complicating factor has been removed, essentially. And the second part, towards what end? You do say that Rouhani is very good at making deals, and certainly his Times nuclear negotiator supports that. And given the fact that Conservatives still do have quite a lot of skin in the game, and you said yourself that you can't expect things to move too fast because otherwise it might be a bit too much of a shock to the system. Do you think this is really an opportunity for them just to really manage the status quo of negotiations much better, rather than actually make concrete steps towards kind of winding down the crisis or actually kind of moving back on some of their nuclear capabilities? Because I'd see, without Ahmadinejad to screw things up, and a kind of a seasoned hand as the president, you've got a perfect opportunity to just basically manage the status quo and string things out for as long as you want.
Absolutely, it's a possibility. I mean, I wish I knew. But the point is, if that's the view that we're going to take, then, well, we might as well just all pack up and go home and expect a strike on Iran tomorrow and then a strike every 3 years, since clearly there's no way to address the problem. I think that I think the Iranians are well aware of their position right now. They're aware that economically they're quite weak. That they don't want the sanctions to continue, despite the fact that they've been saying, oh no, but we're finding ways around it, and we're looking east, etc., etc. So, but they're aware that they're still suffering from them a little bit, and so if they can negotiate to get rid of them, and if they can negotiate to make the Iranian population slightly happier, then surely they'll try and do that. Maybe it's an overly optimistic view of the situation, I'll grant you that, but if you take your position, then like I said, we might as well stop talking to the Iranians.
A supplementary question coming?
No, I just wanted a quick response. I didn't say that maintaining the status quo is a bad thing in any way. That could actually be the best option that we have.
Well, I think some people would disagree. I mean, certainly a lot of Westerners would disagree with that, would say that actually maintaining the status quo would eventually allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon, which is the worst case scenario. So, not my view, but certainly a view. In answer to your first question, what are they happy about, Ahmadinejad leaving or Rouhani coming in? I think both. I think getting rid of Ahmadinejad is kind of taking a weight off everybody's shoulders. And I think that Rouhani coming in is one of a best case scenario, because as we mentioned before, everybody won. Nobody thought so, but even the supreme leaders won. Even his position has been strengthened. Rouhani has support throughout the government and the regime, and so his ability to, like we said, to negotiate, to talk, to make deals, to coax people, to convince people, is much better than say Ahmadinejad's was. So it calls for optimism.
Yes, please.
Yes, Samir Puri, member of the Institute. Carry on from Mark referencing one of Iran's major regional adversaries. I wanted to ask you about Saudi Arabia and how Saudi Arabia might be deciphering Iran's elections. Now, understandably, we're thinking about Iran's elections from a Western perspective. Dina, I think, mentioned two things. Firstly, the Saudi dimension. Secondly, that foreign and security policies in Iran are controlled by the Khatami, so there's continuity there that will outlast change in the elections. But do the Saudis see any positivity in a firebrand like Ahmadinejad being replaced by more of a pragmatist? And with regards to Syria as well, in terms of how the ideological competition of the region is understood between Saudi and Iranian respective positions in recent histories, is there likely to be any change at all in how the two countries would see Syria and the Iranian investment of effort there?
Thank you. So as I mentioned, Rouhani, it seems, does want to at least alleviate some of the tensions in the region, and one of the things that he will focus on is his relations with countries in the Gulf. As I said, one of the driving forces of the CSR, the think tank, was that Iran should focus on the Gulf and the Central Asian states rather than the wider region. So on the Iranian side, although not everybody within the regime will be pro such a policy, I do think that Rouhani will try and make an effort to at least normalize relations to a certain extent with countries like Saudi Arabia. The big question is what's going to happen on the other side. I'm not sure that the Saudis will be ready for a relationship with Iran. Most of the policymakers in Saudi Arabia at the moment are violently anti-Iran, are very afraid of Iran, have made statements to that effect for the last God knows how many years, and are aware of this competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the region for prominence. So I'm not sure actually the Saudis are ready for that. Having said that, there are a lot of changes happening in Saudi Arabia, and the system is very opaque, so it's very hard to know exactly what will happen.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just, I would agree with Dina that I think with Saudi, it will be much more fraught than last time Rouhani involved himself in dealing with Saudi Arabia. I think in the intervening decade, Iraq has acquired a Shia government. In the intervening decade, we had the war in Lebanon, the Hezbollah-Israel war, and we've had Syria. And I think that the mood, especially in the last year, in the aftermath of Bahrain, the ongoing problems in Bahrain, I think that the mood in the region, the sectarian mood, requires this Shia boogeyman. And so in a way, Ahmadinejad's exit is quite inconvenient for the Saudis and the Qataris, or whoever you would like to sort of identify as being quite virulently pushing this kind of sectarian line. And I think we see it in the Sunni clerics who are in Saudi Arabia, people like Qaradawi. And I think it's sort of acquired a momentum of its own. It's quite frightening. But that Rouhani kind of introduces almost an unwelcome shift in that. And that's something that I don't know any of us know how it's going to play out, but I think it will be very fraught. And I think the Saudis, you're absolutely right, may just pull back and not respond, or may have demands that are so sort of oversized that will sort of immediately bring a halt to any kind of discussion.
And just to add to that, I mean, unless there is any Iranian change, any change in Iran's policy in Syria, it's unlikely that the region will view Iran's efforts differently. Because this, as you said, this view of the Shia boogeyman, the country that's spreading sectarianism in the region, is so prominent in Arab minds and in the Arab street now, that it's unlikely that anything other than a change in Iranian policy in Syria will change it.
Said, anything on the Syrian question?
Yes, just a couple of short points. On the Supreme Leader totally controlling the process of foreign policy, this is not totally correct. Yes, the Supreme Leader is very much influential. The Revolutionary Guards are involved in the foreign policy process. The intelligence agencies have an important input. The Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee is an important element. The Foreign Ministry is important. But the President is also an important player. The fact that foreign policy of the Islamic Republic has changed under 4 different presidents testifies to this statement. Foreign policy was different in the revolutionary period. Foreign policy was different under Hashemi Rafsanjani. Foreign policy was different under President Khatami. Year 2000, the United Nations announced the year as the year of dialogue between civilizations on the basis of a proposal by President Khatami. Miss Albright, Madeleine Albright, the U.S. Secretary of State, practically apologized for the involvement of the U.S. government in Iran's 1953 coup. Jack Straw was visiting. These are important elements because the situation has changed. The situation changed under Mr. Ahmadinejad. It went the other way. There was confrontation, and the attitude of confrontation, aggression on behalf of the Iranian regime, and similar response from outside. So to think that, well, Mr. Khamenei is in control, so nothing's changed, is only again, no, this is not true. There are different elements which contribute to the formation of foreign policy, and the president and the cabinet are a very important part of that process.
Thanks. We've got time for just two more questions, which we'll take simultaneously, as it were. Yes, you, sir, at the back.
Thank you. Vinod Kumar, member of the Institute. This has been a very balanced and excellent discussion, but there's one issue I would like the panel to focus a bit more, and that is on the impact of economic sanctions on Iranian economy, and how, given the uncertain, if not lukewarm, Western response to the negotiations, how will that complicate the president's ability to manage the macro economy?
I suspect Jiri Rajendran has a similar question to ask.
Yes, I do. If the elections were mainly about the economy, as Azadeh suggests, it seems to me there are two potential explanations for the election results. One is that people blame the state of the economy on domestic economic mismanagement and thought Rouhani would be more competent in the economic arena. The other is that they believed that the state of the economy was because of the sanctions, and he would be better at negotiating a settlement in which sanctions would be alleviated, therefore improving their lives. And I suppose it's a combination of both of these things that are at play. But I wondered what your thoughts were on, if you could disentangle those two things, if there's any evidence in public opinion for either side of that.
Thank you. We'll just smuggle in one last question here.
Yes, Nazin Ansari. Regarding Mr. Khatami, it was under Mr. Khatami that most of the newspapers were closed, and the student opposition was clamped down, and they were, in prison. So we have to remember that. And also, as far as the election results, the election results showed an inverse correlation between the winner and who was closer to Mr. Khamenei. So the candidates who positioned themselves further from Mr. Khamenei, they're the ones who achieved more, higher votes. But at the same time, if I were the Revolutionary Guards or I were the Basijis, I would be very, very upset. Because in 2009, I stood behind Mr. Khamenei and I clamped down on people. But in 2013, Mr. Khamenei left me out of the circle of power.
Thank you. Azadeh, why don't you tackle the economic questions and then maybe ask Dina and Saeed to touch on some of the broader issues that have just been raised.
Sure. Well, in terms of sanctions and sort of macro management of the economy, they're incredibly intertwined. I think that one thing that will be the chief demand of the Iranian negotiators at the next round, whenever it is the sanctions, the banking sanctions, because that is the sort of crux of what is choking the Iranian economy. No banks will do business with Iran. And until at least that sort of piece of the wider sanctions picture is shifted about, there's very little that can be done, I think, to bring in any kind of investment and to actually transact anything with the sale of oil, with anything. And Iran is operating at a huge loss, having to sell and barter and basically conduct its economy in this kind of informal way. So I think that's going to be the chief demand. Whether they get that at the beginning, I think is very doubtful. I think that there will be some kind of sanctions relief offered. I don't think it will be the big sanctions at all. But I think we'll have to watch and see. I think that will be the opportunity. Will there be any creative diplomacy around that question of will it be just enough to create political cover for Rouhani, but not the sort of high value sanctions that Congress doesn't want moved anytime soon. But beyond that, as I mentioned, I think there's quite a lot of macroeconomic policy shifting that can be handled without sanctions. I mean, just simply the handling of the currency policy and monetary policy will have essentially a piece apart from sanctions, can be handled independently. And reducing the money supply, which is a big cause of inflation, I mean, that is also something that having proper economic planning in place can deal with. So inflation can be brought down, there can be some measure of job creation, and I think that the value of the real can be slightly improved without the sanctions regime being shifted in a dramatic way. So I think there's some that can be done. I'll just quickly address, who is blamed for sanctions, which I think was your question. I think right now it's a fairly mixed sentiment on that. I think that probably the majority, and I think this is something that would differ according to sort of urban class kind of demographic issues. I mean, I think middle class, urban, educated Iranians would probably blame the government for its mismanagement. I think that maybe more rural, smaller town, traditional, slightly working class. I mean, I think it does. I've heard it discussed by Iranian economists and analysts inside, sort of fracturing along those lines. But I think that as sanctions become more intense, I think the blame is shifting. I think the mood is shifting towards blaming the West, and I think that's something that is something that especially America has been concerned about, because there's not been a lot of public diplomacy around the ethical cost of sanctions. I mean, the exemptions for medicines, for example, has not really come off, even though there was a lot of talk about focusing on that. So I think that the mood was sort of shifting towards blaming sanctions rather than the government, but a split along those lines.
Thank you. Dina?
In terms of the impact of sanctions, clearly they have been having an impact. It's harder for Iranians to do business, for example. A lot of the economic indicators within Iran are showing that it's a bit of a mess. But of course that has to be mixed in with a lot of economic mismanagement, as was mentioned before. But Iran's economy is far too big and far too diverse for it to collapse because of sanctions. So that's unlikely to happen. In addition to that, the regime has been very good at focusing the impact, at targeting the impact of sanctions on parts of society that it doesn't like. So, for example, it's done a relatively good job of protecting, of course, regime loyalists, the poorer classes, and then targeting a lot of the sanctions on the middle classes, for example, who are really feeling the impact of sanctions. In terms of one part of your question, yes, the elections were definitely about the economy, but it's actually kind of ironic then that Rouhani was elected, because Rouhani, during his campaign, wasn't very clear on how exactly he would tackle the economy. So I think although the economy was the main topic of the elections, the candidate chosen in the end was not chosen, for his ability to tackle the economy. But having said that, Rouhani is now starting to talk a little bit more about what he would do, what he will do, and for example, boosting the Iranian business community through various measures, loosening up some of the tough rules that were in place before, and how you had to go through the IRGC, etc. So small measures like that, but it's still unclear for now exactly what he'll do.
Said, you have the last word.
Yes, I think just very short point about what you said about the economy. The sanctions have caused problems for the economy and they've caused happiness. But did they directly result in the election of Mr. Rouhani as the new president? No. There were many other elements in the calculation which are as significant as the sanctions. Now, the statement about Khatami's period and the closure of newspapers, you're absolutely right. But it wasn't Khatami who closed them. It was the judiciary, it was the conservatives, the right-wingers, trying to bring down the government by constantly attacking his social base, i.e. The student movement, the women's movement, the closing down the newspapers, arresting his Minister of Interior, putting him in prison for 3 years. And this shows the reality of factional fighting. So this is not a show. The fact that they put his minister in prison for 3 years, this is not a show. This is real politics. This is struggle for power. This is struggle for influence. and it was Khatami as the representative of the reform movement who introduced a fresh new discourse on the rule of law, on the importance of political freedoms, on the importance of social freedoms into the Iranian society, and they managed in the 2009 elections to consolidate these ideas with the Iranian modern middle class, which did not exist previously. So the movement, the reform movement, is making very important, although gradual, steps forward. Regarding your statement about the position of the leader, yes, you're absolutely right. The vote was anti-status quo. People generally voted against what there was. I mean, the system is too close for us to be able to articulate what people were thinking, what they wanted, what they were saying. But we can clearly see that the vote was a protest vote and it was anti-status quo. But the significance of the situation is that the leader saw that coming. He saw the protest vote coming, he saw the anti-status vote coming, and he shifted his position and he planned his strategy according to that behavior. And therefore he consolidated his position and he made a compromise by giving some elements to the opposition, to the people at large, and therefore we can come to the conclusion that he might have strengthened his position. Yes, the Basijis and conservatives are unhappy, but I think their political leadership understands the fact that they have to compromise in order to survive, in order to keep their money, in order to keep their power, in order to keep their fancy houses and fancy cars. They need to compromise, and this is what they've done.
Thank you. Well, I don't know whether it's customary for Iranian presidents to make inaugural addresses, but if they do, clearly this one is going to be worth following on the 3rd of August. And as a result of today's panel, I personally feel much better prepared to read some of the tea leaves, at least. But I think we should do this panel again in a couple of months' time and see how the predictions and the assessments have turned out in the light of events. But for now, at least, please join me in thanking our three speakers today.